Shavua Tov. Well, I guess almost. Shabbat Shalom still. Almost Shavua Tov, everyone. Wishful thinking. Okay. We will begin Mincha on page 214 or page 226 or page 558. And yeah, glad to see y'all. Good to see those of you who have your cameras on. Those of you who don't, hope to see you at some point. אשרי יושבי ביתך, עוד ילוך סלע, אשריהם שככה לו, אשריהם שאדוני אלוהיו, תהילה לדוד, רמיך מלך חשוב. תהילת אדוני ידבר פיו, יברכו בשר שם כל שולם ועד, ואנחנו נברכיה מעתה ועד עולם, הללויה, ובא לציון, גואל השם ושם יעקב, נאום אדוני ואדוני זכותי. ואתה קדוש יושב תהילת ישראל, וקרא זה על זה ואמר, קדוש קדוש קדוש, אדוני צבאות, מלוך לארץ כבודו, מכל בן דוד. קדוש בשמו. ותישאני רוח ושמע אחרי קורש גדול, ברוך שם אדוני במקומו. אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ויבטחו בך יודעי שמך, כי לא עזבת דרכך אדוני, אדוני חפץ למען צדקו, יגדיל תורה וידיר. We will turn now to read some Torah from this upcoming week's Parsha, which is Shemot, very exciting beginning of a new book of Torah. And we will be on page, give me 1 second here. It's going to be, if you're in a regular Bible, it's going to be Exodus 1:1, so very easy to find. And if you're in the Eitz Chaim, it is on page 317. I just want to mention how nice it is to be able to read the first few words of a book of Torah. Typically, I don't get to, so it's nice to be able to read these words and to feel really a new beginning, to be able to go into a new book of Torah is something very special. I always feel a little bit sad going into Shemot because I love Breshit, but Shemot also has beautiful stories that I feel very close to, and it's an exciting thing to always begin a book anew. So again, we're at Exodus 1:1, or if you're in the Eitz Chaim, page 317. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Ve'ele shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma et Yaakov ish uveito ba'u Reuven Shimon Levi v'Yehuda Yisachar Zebulun Binyamin Dan v'Neftali Gad v'Asher Vayehi kol nefesh yotzei yerech Yaakov 70 nefesh ויוסף היה במצרים וימות יוסף וכל אחיו וכל הדור ההוא ובני ישראל פרו וישרצו וירבו ויעצמו במאוד מאוד ותמלא הארץ אותם. Second Aliyah, verse 8, chapter 1. ויקום מלך חדש על מצרים אשר לא ידע את יוסף ויאמר אל עמו הנה בני ישראל רב ועצום ממנו, הווה נתחכמה לו, פן ירבה והיה תקרנה מלחמה, ונוסף גם הוא על שוננו, ונלחם בנו ולמין הארץ. וישימו עליו שרי מיסים למען ענותו בסבלותם. ויבן ערי מסכנות לפרעה את פתאום ואת רעמסס, וכאשר ינועו אותו כן ירבה וכן יפרוץ, ויקוצו מפני בני Israel. Last aliyah for the afternoon, chapter 1, verse 13 through 17. ויבידו מצרים את בני ישראל בפרך, וימררו את חייהם בעבודה קשה, בחומר ובלבנים ובכל עבודה בשדה, את כל עבודתם אשר עבדו בהם בפרך. ויאמר מלך מצרים למיילדות העבריות, אשר שם אחת שפרה ושם השנית פועה, ויאמר בילדכן את העבריות ראיתן על אבנים, אם בן הוא ועמיתן אותו, ואם בת היא וחיה, ותראינה המיילדות את האלוהים, ולא עשו כאשר דיבר עליהם מלך מצרים, ותחיינה את הילדים. Just reading this gets so exciting to be able to start in this story of Moshe. The one thing I'll say is that Shifra and Puah are really remarkable characters, and if you read into commentaries about them, you get to hear how the rabbis also wanted to interpret them as Miriam and Yocheved. And I've always had a little bit of trouble with that, because I want them to just be Shifra and Puah and not have to be associated with Yocheved and Miriam, who on their own right are very impressive women. But if they were if they were Yocheved and Miriam, the way in which their characters really play through the rest of this story is remarkable. So really an honor to be able to bring their names forth even just at the beginning of this book. We'll continue now with Mincha, with the silent Amidah, the whispered Amidah, which can be found on page 223 or 234 or 574. If you have not yet finished your Amidah, please continue at your own pace. We're just going to continue with the paragraph following the Amidah right before Kaddish Shalem, and then we'll turn to Aleinu on page 231, 248, or 598. צדקתך אעשה לילה, ותורתך אמת, וזכרך לאלוהים, על מרום אשר עשית גדולות, Adam Avema Toshia Adonai. If you're able to do so, please rise. Aleinu l'shabeach ladon hakol. Let it give light. Sever shishavas and if you go sever those minutes. ואנחנו קוראים משתחווים ומודים לפי מלך מלכי המלכים. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Kaddish Yatom, Mourner's Kaddish, page 232, page 249, or page 600. Yit Gadal ve'yit Kadash Shemei Rabbah be'alma divra kirute ve'amlich malchute b'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayed chol beit Israel ba'agala u'v'zman kariv ve'imru amen Yehei Shemei Rabbah mevarach le'olam u'lamei almaya Yit barach ve'yishtabach ve'yit pa'ar ve'yit romam ve'yit naseh ve'yit hadar ve'yit aleh ve'yit halal shemei dekudesha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata ve'shirata tush bechata ve'nechemata da'amiran be'alma ve'imru amen Yehei shalama rabba min shemaya ve'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen Oseh shalom b'romav Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imru amen. I'll turn this over now to Rachel to teach us a little Torah before we continue with Mariv.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Schatz. Just because I'm in another time zone, I want to make sure I understand the times correctly. Is Havdalah, so I know Zoom out is at, what would be 6:40 your time?
Yeah, so Havdalah is at 5:36. So
okay.
If I were leading Mariv, I would want to start probably around 5:20, which is about 25 minutes from now.
Okay, great. Thank you for your mathematical expertise.
No
in
problem.
Addition to your, it's something we take in rabbinical school, rabbinic math. All right, so we have the fun, good fortune this week of starting a new book, like Rabbi Schatz beautifully started for us with her chanting in the secular new year. So I thought that was a nice convergence of just our timelines this year. So I decided to focus on the transition from the end of Bereshit into the beginning of Shemot to help us reflect unto itself on like what that transition looks like in the Torah, and then see if that has anything to offer us in thinking about the narrative that we might tell ourselves or put out into the world about what it's like to start a new chapter of our life in the new year in 2021. So if you have the source sheet, great. If not, some of the sections are very easy to refer to in a Tanakh or Eitz Chaim. So we're going to start by reading just the first about 6 psukim in English, which we heard from Rabbi Schatz already, but just kind of a review that the beginning of Exodus, the name of the book in Hebrew is Shemot, because it begins by listing literally the names of the people who were the sons of Jacob or Israel who came into Egypt. So verses, this is either source 1 on the sheet, or just if you have a Tanakh, Exodus 1 chapters verses 1 to 6. Sorry. So these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. And then it gives, after listing the names, the total number of people who were in their households, basically. The total number that were of Jacob's issue came to 70, Joseph being already in Egypt. Joseph died and all his brothers in that generation. So if you started reading this book having never read anything else in the Torah, that might be helpful background. But the reality is, if you are somebody who's been following along the entire time, it might strike you that this is actually not new information. So if we were to go back to Genesis, what's listed as source number 2 on the sheet, Genesis chapter 46, starting at verse 8, we see something pretty similar with just kind of slightly more detail about who their sons were. That it basically says these are the names of all the people who were in Egypt that were descendants of Jacob or Israel. These are the names of the Israelites, Jacob and his descendants who came to Egypt. Jacob's firstborn, Reuven, and then it lists Reuven's sons, Shimon's sons, and then it goes on to list each of Jacob's sons and their sons. So you kind of get like a slightly more detailed sense, like mini census of who all the people were, the Israelites that ended up in Egypt. And we know Joseph was there because we've been reading the whole Joseph story and all that jazz. And then even the statement at the beginning of Exodus that Joseph had died, a good chunk of the last like couple chapters of Genesis is going through the whole thing about like what's happening as Joseph is dying and telling his brothers like, I'm about to die. Please take my bones with you, this, that, and the other. And just kind of as a quick summary of all of that, what's listed as source number 3 on the sheet is Genesis 50:26, where it just says Joseph died at the age of 110 years. He was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt. Like that's the like at the end of Bereshit. So if you've been reading anything before where we are now, you would notice that the first several verses of Shemot is not really new information. So before we look at any commentaries about this phenomenon, what would be your thoughts about why, like, whoever you think the author or authors of the Torah are, what would be the reason for starting off this new book with information that is basically a recap? Larry?
To slightly change your question or answer a different question.
Great.
I would add verses 1 through 7 if in fact I were taking the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus, and the foundation story of the new people, but I wanted to connect it to a previous foundation story, which actually had its foundation in a land that these people are going to go to. I would need to write a connection, and that would be the connection I would write. I find it interesting, and I don't know exactly how far it goes. If you start in verse 8, besides the mention of the king who knew not Joseph, that's the end. There's no reference to Jacob, to Israel. I haven't gone far enough to see when was the first time that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are mentioned in Shemot. I'm sure that they are.
Possibly at the burning bush. I mean, I know that they are at the burning bush. I haven't, I'd have to do a like quick sweep through it to see if it's anything in between them. But I know at the burning bush, when God is talking to Moshe, God says like, I'm the one who spoke to all these other people. So I don't know, Rabbi Schatz, if you have other info you can weigh in here. But to my knowledge, that's the first like example that's jumping out at me. So yeah, what you're saying is really interesting, that if we were to start after the mention of there was a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, that the memory of Pharaoh and all the people in Egypt, and as it's recorded in the story, it's like you're starting in a new era and you wouldn't even know what had come before. So there's some need to connect it to the past. So great. Joanna?
So talking about like, a comparison to a foundation story, I think there's a comparison here to the very first foundation story, to chapter 1 of Bereshit. And especially when you get to that line about how they multiplied and they increased, that language is very reminiscent of the increase that happens in, as creation is happening and how everything is going to multiply and increase. So if this is going to be a very foundational story of the creation of a nation. So we're starting to parallel that. And also how incredibly important names are in the creation story, right? That as things are created and as Adam is created, everything gets their name. So I see a strong parallel there. And the other thing also I think that is really significant to note is how this chapter starts here in verse 1 with Bnei Yisrael, meaning literally the children of Israel. And by verse 13, we're starting to talk in a more expansive version of Bnei Yisrael. So already here, we're starting to see that transformation of a family becoming a nation.
Great, beautiful. And what both of you have already pointed out is that part of the mission of Exodus is to tell a story of not just a clan like we've been reading about in Bereshit, but what becomes an a people. So there's various really nice connections that you've pointed out in how it's set up to show that evolution of becoming a people. Beautiful. Any other, Brant?
I think this is significant in the number 70 for some reason. Like they make a point of pointing out the number 70. So these 70 people are clearly direct descendants from the patriarchs in a very direct way. And there's a reason why they're mentioned here. And it's not the whole big Israel, it's the small Israel. And these are special people. I don't know why they pick 70, but there's some reason they mentioned 70 here. And these 70 people are direct descendants from the patriarchs. And that's what's significant about this paragraph.
Interesting. So are you saying that there's maybe a desire to point out a difference between who will become the masses and these special people?
I think that as the Israelites get to be more numerous is where they start having problems with the Egyptian population. But at this point, this is a 70 very special people that are not ordinary people, and they're at a very high spiritual or whatever existence plane. And these people are not the rest of us. When we get to the rest of us, that's when we start having this problem with, existing in a land that's not our own. But as long as it was just these 70 people, this is a fairly rarefied air. And that's why they mention it.
Nice. So that's a great segue into some of the commentaries that we'll look at, because I think there are pieces of what you just mentioned that will appear in a couple of these commentaries. So is there a volunteer with the source sheet who would like to read source number 4, what Rashi says about Exodus 1:1? Do I see a Bacharach volunteer? Gary? You can go for it.
Source 4, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Why repeat this information? Rashi on Exodus. Okay. These are the names of the children of Israel. Even though the Torah has already enumerated them by name while they were living, it returned and enumerates them in telling of their death, in order to show how dear they were to God. Great, thank you. So if you, Gary or Marlise or anyone, if you were to just summarize in your own thinking, like what Rashi is saying here, why it was important to say that their names again. Just restating, so by emphasis, that they were important to God.
Yeah, the relationship to God. It's not just names. It's just not Joe on the street. This is a person that is with God thinks that this person is a special person. Very nice. And one way that we can tell God cares about someone is even after they're no longer living, they still get mentioned. And I didn't add this part in the English just to save some space, but Rashi goes on to quote a midrash talking about how like the stars, each person is named in their being born and
they're going out and they're dying, and that, it shows how much God loves them, that the text calls them by name in both of those moments. So great. So far we have Rashi's reasoning that we just, for emphasis, want to have it repeated that these people are very important to God. So we need to mention them again in the book of Exodus. Excellent. So we're going to go on to hear Chizkuni. It's a short point, but interesting, I think. Is there anyone who'd like to read source 5, the Chizkuni? Larry, great. Go for it.
Since I'm a big Chizkuni fan, he says the prefix letter Vav in the word Va'ela is intended to connect what is written here to what has been written previously at the end of Bereshit.
Great. So just, it's sort of a technical point, but also a thematic one that Shemot is the first significant word in the book. That's why the name of the book is Shemot, but it's not actually the first thing that is said. It's Ve'ela, and these. So right off the bat, he's noticing that it's like you pick up volume 2 in a trilogy or something, that it's clearly showing it comes after something else, because there's this Vav that automatically connects it to what came previously. So excellent. Any other thoughts or questions so far before we go to the third commentary? Joanna?
More so connected maybe to the previous than this one, but I just had the thought that the name Yad Vashem, which is a phrase from Isaiah where it talks about, having a monument and a name, and that name will be everlasting, as a way of remembering, people who have passed away. And like that, we don't just, like, the Hebrew quite literally is not just a memorial, but says how important it is to remember the name.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, it's something that's embedded in so many aspects of Jewish culture that we give names to new babies for people who have passed away, to say that, like, as this person will continue living through their name. So it really, it's significant to hear names after someone has died, which is what we're doing in the book in the beginning. And a couple people already mentioned that there's going to be like a new birth of a nation. So perhaps these names can be some of the inspiration for, like what people and qualities are getting infused in this new creative process that's going to be happening, going from, the just a handful, a group of 70 of Israelites to Am Yisrael. Great. So let's go on to hearing what Rashbam has to say about this first verse in Shemot. Would anybody like to read number 6 on the sheet, Rashbam? I saw a hand. Larry, go for it.
Sure. Ve'elat Shemot, seeing that the Torah wanted to let us know how the Israelites had increased and multiplied, it became necessary to repeat that when they had arrived in Egypt, they had numbered only 70 souls.
Great. So this Rashbam is saying the information becomes newly significant when it's repeated in a new context. So while we may have already known that was the number, we are hearing it in relation to, I think at least one person has already pointed out that, Brant, that was you, right? Talking about how that they started to have problems when it became the more than 70. So by repeating that they started as 70, it can help illustrate both how much they grew, and also just kind of the past, to explain how they got on that trajectory of getting into this conflict and all that jazz. So what I thought was interesting about this Rashbam, and then I'm curious to hear your thoughts about any of them again, but it just reminded me that hearing the same piece of information, in this case, it's, a fact, it's the number of people, in relation to something else, or if you know the story that becomes before or after, can have different significance. Like at the end of the book of Genesis, we might have thought, wow, there were 70 people who were all connected to Yisrael, who were in Egypt, and wow, they had like a pretty strong group going there. But then when we hear about how much they continued to multiply, looking back, it's like, oh, there weren't actually that many people, or maybe we do still think it was a lot of people. But it's just interesting how the same piece of information in a different context can take on different meanings. So for me, it was Rashbam in particular that got me thinking about what it might mean going into the secular new year. Because at least in a lot of people I'm seeing on social media and things like that, it seems like there's a strong urge for people to want the break in the year to be totally as if nothing came before, and it's totally new. Obviously, when the clock struck midnight in whatever time zone you live in on January 1st, 2021, of course, all of the woes and concerns and everything that came before in 2020 are gone, and we can say 2021 is going to be a totally new, fresh experience. Like whatever my problems were, they're gone. The good things can stay, but that's it. And I think that seeing some of these commentaries and like from the Rashbam mindset, that you can repeat the same piece of information, but maybe it's going to mean something different. And I think that there's something to that, to say you can still start a new chapter, but you can take some piece of what came before and connect it to a story that's going to be different. So I guess I'm kind of curious to hear other reflections on any of these pieces. But yeah, so just curious to hear your thoughts in general about these commentaries and the bridge between these two books, and like, are we starting a new story or is it a continuation of the old story?
I'd like to comment on the secular New Year, if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, please. That's where we're going next for the rest of the time.
What I'm saying is that we're being too harsh on it.
Yeah.
The reality is people in the world do not stop and reflect often enough. And if the greater world stops on New Year's to reflect a little bit about where we've been and where we might head, then the New Year serves a valid purpose. In other words, you could make the same argument about birthdays or about attending high school graduations, reunions or something like that. But every once in a while, you have to stop. You have to think at what transpired over the last year or the 10 years when you saw these people last, and what it means about going forward. In that sense, the secular New Year serves a very valid purpose for the greater society, even though it's not like a religious New Year like Rosh Hashanah. So I've heard twice today the kind of belittling of the secular New Year, and I just don't see it that way. So
gotcha.
Both you and Rabbi Schatz, and I keep wondering, where's that coming from?
Oh no. Thank you for that reflection. I think that helps me see like how what image I must have been presenting about it. I think my view of it isn't to belittle it. I think it is actually, like, I'm appreciative that as a Jewish person I have a chance for the Jewish New Year and the secular New Year to have those reflection points. I think the danger in it is when we fall into an illusion that it is, it's an arbitrary breaking point, which can be helpful for reflection, as you pointed out. I think where it can get used in a dangerous way is when people fall into a trap of thinking that's like I'm holding on to the illusion of control because of that arbitrary break in how we measure time, and not taking the lessons that are really connecting, like in the way that Shemot wasn't a totally new story. There had to be, we've seen all these many reasons, there had to be some points reiterated from what came before. and which doesn't mean it's tied to all of the challenges or heartbreak or any of the things that come up in the stories of Bereshit, but it means it has to remember that those happened. So I think that, like, as you're saying, Brant, it actually, like, it can be a super important time to reflect. And we actually need to, like, hold on to a piece of what came before, even if it's really hard, to inform the story that we're trying to write in the new year. Does that resonate with any of your feelings? Great, I appreciate that comment. Other thoughts? We can kind of jump into the reflecting about the secular New Year piece too. Larry?
I'm not. I'm going to go back to the text.
Beautiful.
And for this one, I wish Rick were here, Rick Muller. So the first 7 verses I'm suggesting were added on.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that the trope on the first 7 verses, 4 of the verses have no etnachta. And you've got that funny list of the names of the 11 sons. And the 11 sons are divided into 4, 3, 4. And there's no, the etnachta usually divides the verse into 2. But then you've also got that interesting and strange verse about the death of Yosef. I guess it's verse 7. If I'm looking in the right place, sorry.
It's verse 6, I think.
Verse 6, right. You're right. Thank you. V'yamat Yosef v'chol achav v'chol hador hahu. And that's also doesn't have an etnachta. And I don't have any basis for saying this, but all of that suggests, and I don't know that anywhere else in the Torah, it could be, that the Masoretes put that many verses together without an etnachta. You see it all the time. It's not that rare. But to have 4 of them out of the first 7 suggests to me some sort of appendage here, that these verses were just sort of scrunched on here as a joiner. That's all.
Could be. I would have to personally do more research about the history of it with the Masoretes, but that's super interesting. I hadn't actually noticed that about the etnachtas, and I would think that would suggest that there was some kind of unified, different vision for what those verses were doing.
I'll just add, even when we read the 10 Commandments, at least in Yitro, the trope that we use when we're reading it during the normally in the Torah doesn't have divided verses. It's only when we read it with the special trope that we actually divide those short commandments into separate verses. So that would be another place where you would have a whole series of verses without an etnachta, because you've got those 2-word verses, and all that other,
right.
all that.
Right. Interesting. Well, more to learn about. Wait, I just saw a hand. Rebecca? And then I know Rabbi Schatz had a comment too, but Rebecca.
That's okay.
On the, I was just thinking in terms of the names and naming Jacob's 12 sons, when we look back at what we read this morning at the beginning of chapter 49, where Jacob goes through each of the sons and talks about them individually, and that's as they were individuals. But then, at the end of Bereshit, they all come together and bury their father, and Yosef is the only one really who's mentioned. So they're not mentioned again as they came together. So I'm thinking perhaps in the listing of the sons together now at the beginning of Shemot, it's again showing that they came together, and they're not individual with their individual attributes like they were before. They've buried their father, and the verse talks about the sons who came with Jacob, and then it just lists their names. So now they're all sort of united as a unit together.
Nice. Does that change your understanding of like what this introduction to Shemot is doing, if that unity is important?
Yeah. I mean, because it starts out with them united as this family unit. Yeah.
Nice. So that can like inform how we're how we might think about the book from there. Obviously, some conflict arises, not so much between them at that point, eventually, but very interesting. Great point. Thank you. Any other thoughts? I mean, my general reflection question, if there's no other, Rabbi Schatz, let's go to you, and then I'll have a question. Yeah.
It's okay. It's very short. I was just gonna say that I'm always struck every year that the way in which we enter Shemot is a very different view into this family than we've had ever before. So similar to what Rebecca actually just said, that there is a sense of unity here that we never see except for at the kind of final moments of certain pieces of the past two parshiot. And yet the way in which the Pharaoh is understanding these people is that they were so together that they've become now populated far beyond what any Egyptian could ever imagine. And it just makes me think about families in oh, hello, Rosie. It makes me think about families in general, that we don't necessarily know what's going on the inside, but that I'm a very from dog in the house, but that we have to be on the inside to really know what the relationships are like, rather than this eagle eye view, which is what this new Pharaoh had of this family, of not necessarily understanding what the real relationship and the real strife was about.
Interesting. Right. They got read differently or misunderstood. The other thing that your comment just made me think of is that when we choose to hold on to a piece of the story, but also let go of a piece of the story, that there's the mentioning at the beginning of Shemot of those brothers without the strife that carried us through a good chunk of Breshit.
Yeah.
And that there's something, I think, hopeful about the fact that you can name a piece of the story that you're holding on to from the past, but also allow it to have some new life and new unity, and like to say, this is the narrative about it that I'm putting forth right now about this thing that also had complicated pieces too. Mm-hmm. Which kind of leads me to my final question, if a couple people want to weigh in, is just to say, as we're going into the new secular year, is there something that you're a piece that you're holding on to that you want to maybe in part like include but name differently, include but present differently, that there's something from the story in the past year that is important to you to hold on to in this new chapter, but also maybe it's going to take on a slightly new life in the new year? So reflections, is there something that you want to bring into the new year, or want to let go of, or like something in between? Marlise?
Okay. It's not necessarily making different, but I guess I was commenting back on what you were saying about people kind of wanting to just have this year 2020 be gone. And for me, being in a place of mourning, I look back on the year as like the last year that I had some time with my mother, and be it secular or Jewish year. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to just wish that away and say, be gone with it. It's something that I think, as in the verses connecting Breshit and Shemot, and as in just our tradition, which is, memory is such a big part of that, that I take comfort in that, and do want to hold on to that, and not, obviously taking it into my life now, which is very different than it was before, but it's something I want to continue and honor.
Absolutely. And Zichrona Livracha, and may her memory and name be a blessing, as we're seeing in the way that can bring us forward too in this chapter. Thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else? We maybe have time for one more reflection. All right. Well, whatever is in your mind and heart that you are holding on to a piece of, but also breathing some new life into it for this new year. I hope all of your wishes and hopes will come to fruition in their own way, and that we'll also be able to connect our stories to what has come before and not shy away from those previous chapters. And without further ado, let us begin the Mariv service, which begins on page 264, 281, or 200. V'vurachum yechaper avon v'lo yashchit, v'hirba l'shiva po v'lo ya'ir kol chamato. Adonai Hoshea hamelech ya'anenu v'yom koreinu. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam v'shavim. Umavir yomu mevi laila, umavdil ben yomu ben laila, Adonai tzvaot shemo. El chai v'kayam tamid yimloch aleinu le'olam va'ed. Baruch atah Adonai ha'ma'ariv ha'ravim. Ahavat olam bet Yisrael amcha atah. Ve'ahavatcha al tasir mimenu le'olamim. Baruch atah Adonai ohev amo Yisrael. El melech ne'eman. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Leman tizkeru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'yitem kedoshim Elohechem. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim liot lachem Elohim. Ani Adonai Elohechem. Emet lemunach v'zot. Umalchuto b'ratzon kivlu aleihem Moshe ubnei Yisrael lachanu shira b'simcha rabba v'amru chulam. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh, nora tehilot osef ele, malchutecha ruvanecha bokei hayam lifnei Moshe, ze elianu v'amru Adonai himloch le'olam va'ed. V'ne'emar kifada Adonai et Yaakov, uge'alo mi'ar chazak mimenu, Baruch atah Adonai Ga'al Yisrael. Hashkivenu, page 267, 284, or 206. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu l'shalom, v'hamidenu l'kenu l'chenu l'chosavenu l'sachar shalom. Ushmor teitenu v'oenu l'chaim l'shalom me'atzah v'ad olam. Baruch atah Adonai shomer amo Yisrael la'ad. Baruch amen v'amen. כי המלכות שלך היא ולעולמי עד תמלוך בכבוד, כי אין לנו מלך אלא אתה. ברוך אתה אדוני המלך בכבודו, תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ועל כל מעשיו. We are skipping Chatzi Kaddish and going to the Amidah at the conclusion of Shabbat. So please include the extra additions at the end of Shabbat. We'll join back together at the end with Oseh Shalom. Oseh Shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, ve'imru, imru, amen. Yananananai, you are still davening, please feel free to continue. And for anyone who's ready, we'll continue with the concluding sections at the end of Shabbat. So it's page 280, 294, and 688. But we're skipping the Kaddish Shalem. So jump forward. Eloheinu Aleinu Uma'aseh Yadeinu Konena Aleinu Uma'aseh Yadeinu Koneneu. Yikraeni ve'enehu imo anochi v'tzara achaltzehu v'achavdehu orechem mimashpiyehu va'arehu bishuati orechem mimashpiyehu va'arehu bishuati ve'ata kadosh she'tilot Yisrael v'karazeh el zevramar kadosh 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 Adonai Tzevaot melech haaretz kivodo. V'tisaini rach v'shmach v'kol rash gadol Baruch kavod Adonai mimkamon. Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. V'yiftechu v'cha yodei shemecha ki lo azavta dorshecha Adonai. Adonai chafetz laman tzidko yagdil Torah ve'adir. We now go to Aleinu, page 281, 297, or 696. Aleinu l'shabeach l'Adonai kol. ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. Is there anyone feeling inspired to lead us in Kadisha Tov Mourner's Kaddish?
I'll do it.
Okay, thank you.
Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah.
Amen.
V'alma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei. B'chayechon uvyamechon uv'chaye dechol beit Yisrael. Ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen.
Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevorach Le'olam Ulamei Almaya.
Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevorach Le'olam Ulamei Almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitale v'yitala shemei dekudsha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tush b'chata v'nechamata da'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen.
Oseh shalom bimramav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
Amen. Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for leading us in that. And thank you all for adding to our tefillah and learning today. Rabbi Schatz will now lead us in Havdalah.
Yanai na 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 na. Yanai na 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 yanai. Yanai na 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 na. Yanai na 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 yanai na na. Yanai na 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 na. Yanai na 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 na. Yanai na 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 na. Yaina na Hine el Yeshuati Eftach velo efchad Ki ozi vezimratia Adonai vayehili lishua Ushaftemai besason Mimainei ha-Yeshua L'Adonai Yeshua, Alamcha v'chatecha sela, Adonai Tzevaot, Imanu, Miskav lanu, Elohei Yaakov sela, Adonai Tzevaot, Ashrei Adam boteach bach, Adonai Yoshia, Hamelech Yaneinu ve'yom koreinu la Yehudim Haita ora ושמחה וששון ויקר, כן תהיה לנו כוס ישועות תשא, ובשם אדוני אקרא, יין עיני, יין עיני, יין עיני, יין עיני. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא פרי הגפן. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא מיני ושמים. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא מאורי האש. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, המבדיל בין קודש לחול, בין אור לחושך, בין ישראל לעמים, בין יום השביעי לששת ימי המעשה. ברוך אתה אדוני המבדיל בין קודש לחול. המבדיל בין קודש לחול, חטאותינו ימחול. זרענו וחסדנו ירבה ירבה ככוכבים בלילה. זרענו וחסדנו ירבה ירבה ככוכבים בלילה. שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב. שבוע טוב, שבוע טוב, אליהו הנביא, אליהו התשבי, אליהו, אליהו, אליהו הגלעדי, במהרה בימינו יבוא אלינו, עם משיח בן דוד, עם משיח ben David. Shavua Tov, everyone. So wonderful to see you, and hope you have a wonderful week. First week of 2021. May it only bring you blessing and beautiful reflection. And Yashar Koach to Rachel for leading us. And we will see you throughout the week. Shavua Tov.